Me start then by welcoming everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Les Lonkowsky, and I'm a professor emeritus from the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, as well as the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I have worked with Professor Craiutu in putting together the Tocqueville lecture series. And he asked me today to take on the moderating responsibilities, which is a pleasure because we have a very interesting presentation today that I think will spark a lot of discussion. Our speaker is Professor Ken Kersch, who's a professor of political science at Boston College. His work has won numerous awards, and he has authored five five books, chiefly focusing on American political thought and constitutionalism. His topic today is going to be the Messianic executive in American conservative political thought. And I was joking prior to us opening this up that it is very fitting to be talking about Messianic thinking in the Passover Easter period. Um, so we're delighted to have him with us. He will make a presentation. His full paper is available on the Tocqueville lecture program website, but he will make a presentation based on it. Then we will open the floor for questions and comments. What I'd ask you to do is what we've done in the past, which is if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, send a note into the chat function, and I will recognize you as time permits. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn this over to Professor Ken Kersch. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Les, for that introduction. Thank you for doing this. I would also like to thank Aurelian Craiutu for inviting me to participate in the Ostrom workshop and the Tocqueville lecture series, and Alison Sturgeon for her help in making the necessary arrangements. I should say I'm very sorry that I'm not in Bloomington because I've never been to Bloomington, and for this a more normal year, I would have very much appreciated coming to Indiana University. My topic today is two very different ways to think about US constitutionalism in post-war conservative political thought. Obviously, when we think, or at least many of my students, when they think about conservative constitutionalism and constitutional thought, they immediately think of originalism and the law school version of that, which is based in a theory of legal interpretation. But in an audience of political scientists and political theorists, I think we know that there is an extensive tradition of conservative constitutional thought that predated the rise of modern law school originalism and was constitutive of much of conservative movement, political thought, and intellectual life prior to that. One of the themes of the book in which this talk at least comes out of, a book I wrote called Conservatives and the Constitution, is that those worlds are now beginning to merge a bit more than they had in the past. And it's quite possible that that merger will affect the trajectory of even of law school and legal originalism, the content of it. Now, the interest in this post-war debate might be merely antiquarian, a bit of intellectual history, were it not for the fact that one of these two schools, Harry Jaffa's, they've called it propositionalist constitutional thought, played a major role in underwriting intellectual support on the right for Donald Trump. And culminating, as I would see it, in the events of January 6th. Which I consider, I don't think idiosyncratically unprecedented in American history, and a very, very serious and unfortunate event. So there is a direct connection between this intellectual history, I believe, and current events. Now, when most people talk about conservatives in the executive, and the idea of conservative support for an all-powerful or close to all-powerful executive, much of the discussion tends to trend towards concepts of authoritarianism, obviously. There's the tendencies on the right towards friend-enemy distinctions, and the critiques often refer to Carl Schmitt. I mean, Sandy Levinson has done this. The implication is that there is a strain of illiberalism within American conservatism, and that this tendency, when it arises, stems from a tradition of illiberal Schmittian authoritarianism, in some cases neo-monarchism, ultramontane Roman Catholicism, and that wolf comes as a wolf, right? I mean, it's often explicitly illiberal, and certainly illiberalism in, since the French Revolution has been a part of conservative political thought. Jaffa's propositionalism is interesting to me and significant in part because it's not a wolf coming as a wolf. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing, and very decked out in sheep's clothing. I mean, it comes in highly advertised liberal raiment. And Jaffa's proposition is that the foundation of the Republic is the principle of the equality of natural rights. So you don't get more liberal than that, at least in its formulation, its outward formulation by Jaffa. So this sheep's clothing essentially argues that the American nation find its constitutional foundations in a commitment to the principle of the equality of natural rights as recognized in the Declaration of Independence, right? And as vindicated by Abraham Lincoln in ending chattel slavery. The road from that articulation of this to executive messianism, to Caesarism, to Donald Trump seems like it would be a very winding road. Because in some sense, of course, this understanding of the American nation has to be true. It seems like it would not lead to authoritarianism of this sort. But it's what Jaffa does with that proposition that sets this path, I will arguing. And the path what Jaffa does with this is actually quite idiosyncratic. There's a certain element of alchemy here that involves both philosophy, on the one hand, a relation of philosophy to a story about American history, second, and then third, an application of that history, that philosophy, to the contemporary state of America and contemporary events. So it's those three dimensions that are the bricks in the path that lead from this, rather abstract statement of propositionalism to current manifestations of it in support or an inclination to support Donald Trump. And the worst of Donald Trump. Not that I haven't, my opinion is there's not much better of Donald Trump, but let's just say the worst of Donald Trump. So let's start with philosophy and then history and then application. As far as philosophy is concerned, the propositionalist philosophy is superficially Lockean. Harry Jaffa is famous for this. Obviously, the articulation of equality of natural rights, a social contract to preserve those rights is directly Lockean. But Jaffa's alchemy and idiosyncrasy is that he reads Locke through the lens of Aristotle and Aristotelian teleology in ways that also has resonance with Thomism. And so for Jaffa, the equality of natural rights are not just what we will, but what we ought to will. And he has a very rigorous definition of that, which links the idea of natural rights to natural law. And in fact, uses those terms almost interchangeably. And then he has a very robust understanding of natural law. And therefore, Jaffa's supposedly Lockean and liberal view resembles the view of people who were around at the same time he's writing, pre-Vatican II Catholicism, whether it's Fulton J. Sheen, Cardinal Francis Spellman, and more interestingly, in complicated ways, John Courtney Murray, who has his own version of this that is off of propositionalism, centered on the Declaration and Lincoln, but is offered in a very different spirit than Jaffa's. A more, I would say, a more liberal spirit, even if we can question whether it's liberal. So, and I would tie that Aristotelian or Thomistic reading of the Principle of the Declaration and Locke to current figures writing on the legal right, like Robert P. George of Princeton, and even Amy Coney Barrett. So for purposes of this talk, what's significant about this is that it has a path to influencing Article III courts in the structural sense, through new legal theory that is informed by Jaffa's approach and Catholic thought as well. Okay, the second dimension of this is historical. Jaffa doesn't just set out this as a philosophy. He writes about history, and his history centers on the slavery question and the Civil War. And so that is his primary illustration of this. And he frames this most fully in his book on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Crisis of the House Divided. And in this book and in his other writings, he presents Abraham Lincoln as a redeemer president, a godlike hero who, in Jaffa's reading, is of signal importance because as Jaffa reads him, he restored the country to its natural rights and natural law foundations. So the philosophy is closely tied to this history, which is partly symbolic. I mean, Lincoln and the Declaration are Lincoln especially, are simple to this. So tying it to Lincoln also means that it is a comment on, I wrote the branches wrong. I was tired when I wrote this, but the Article II presidency. right? That he links this vision to the Article 2 presidency. So now we've got a link to two different branches, or at least a conduit for these views. And then, so in Jaffa's historical telling, Lincoln restored the country to its natural law foundations while in the act of ending slavery. But the application is, he has a post history of this, and this will surprise no one who's a student of Leo Strauss or Leo Strauss. The progressives or the modernists repudiated this foundation. Historicists, relativists, positivists, secularists, nihilists. Jaffa and Jaffaites identify all of them. They not only say they're wrong on philosophic grounds, they identify them with Stephen Douglas, popular sovereignty, and the move to protect chattel slavery. And Jaffa treats this as a catastrophic repudiation by modern progressives with apocalyptic consequences. And the application of it is almost exclusively to culture war issues. So it's applied to abortion, it's applied to gay rights, it's applied to the war on Christians. And those questions are framed through the prism of this, in which the conservatives have positioned themselves as the defenders of natural rights, natural law, standing in the shoes of Lincoln, who was an opponent of slavery. So they put themselves in the position of the abolitionists. So the argument from Jaffa is that civilizational collapse was caused by an abandonment of Lincoln's teaching concerning the American proposition as set out in that crucial sentence in the Declaration of Independence. So, I mean, I could critique this, we could talk about this, but again, this is intellectual history. So I'm sure progressives and liberals, would have their own critiques of this if they paid any attention to it, or Jaffa, which they typically do not or have not until very, very recently. But I want to point out that there were critics of this imagination of American constitutionalism and American nationalism within the conservative movement at mid-century. And the implication of my paper, I think, is pretty clear, is I think that these critiques from within the conservative movement are prescient. I do think that now that we've had Trump, with staunch support from people believing in this propositionalism, I think that it's much more obvious how prescient these mid-century critics were. Okay, so who were these anti-propositionalists? First of all, let me make clear that they were expressly anti-propositionalists. This is not by implication. They were writing articles criticizing Jaffa and warning about the implications of this understanding of American constitutionalism, American nationalism. We can loosely call these people the structuralist constitutionalists within the conservative movement, who argued this was a wrong and even dangerous way to understand the American constitutional order. And they went beyond this and said, hence the title, they warned that it would create executive messianism and Caesarism as conservatives turned for deliverance to a messianic president who would deliver them and reestablish national law as the foundation for the country. Okay, so these structures had a very different understanding of the constitutional order. I'll just list a few and some very basic points. Wilmore Kendall and Jeffrey Hart. I put them together because it's Wilmore Kendall who's the chief theorist of this critique, and Jeffrey Hart, who's an English professor at Dartmouth College, a very prominent conservative, he adopted Kendall's view and wrote from that perspective a lot within National Review and other places. So they're a tag team, and it's Kendall's view that's being promoted by Hart. So I'll just blend them together. So Kendall's basic theory of the Constitution is that the foundational principles, which he also believed in, were set out in the preamble of the Constitution. And then the signal fact about the Constitution is that it created a set of institutions, 3 branches of government separated, a division between the national power and powers of the states. And Kendall also stipulated that the Article I Congress was clearly intended to be the supreme institution of the government, the preeminent institution of the government, constitutional government. And that these were set out, he borrows the term deliberate sense from Hamilton's 71st Federalist. And he said that the Constitution at its base is a structure for achieving the goals of the preamble through building a slow, deliberate, it's sort of as a filter, a go slow filter with the separation of power to help build consensus for moving the polity towards collective decision making. And he emphasized, not surprisingly, the cooling of emotions, of tempers. He emphasized pluralism, disagreement as a regular feature of this system, even of compromise as a regular system of this. And Kendall argued that the best way to subvert this understanding of the Constitution was to overdevelop the Article II presidency and the Article III judiciary over and above Congress. And the main charge of Hart, taking this same view, was that this is something liberals had done. And partly what they were critiquing was liberals who built modern executive power, and this is the era of the Warren Court and the Burger Court, had overdeveloped the powers of the judiciary. But Kendall's warning was that Jaffa's propositionalism was a form of basing the Constitution on a redemptive moralism. And they threatened, by doing this, it threatened to do the same thing the liberals were doing. It threatened looking to an all-powerful executive and threatened a judiciary which was going to turn to natural law and be an activist versus unrestrained judiciary. Should I answer questions? I have a question or not.
Why don't we hold them till the end? And if the questioner could just send me a note on chat, I will address them in the order received.
Okay. So that was one critique, and that was a warning of that conservatism under Jaffa would repeat these mistakes. Now we also had critiques from Martin Diamond, Walter Burns. All I will say about them is that they're proceeding from the same premises, not the exact same theory as Kendall, but they are basically institutionalists and structuralists. And they emphasize that rather than a redemptive moralism as the foundation. The libertarian Frank Meyer, libertarians in the American libertarian movement never liked Lincoln, right? And now he's moved to the center of a lot of conservative thought. But they criticized Lincoln for disregarding how power was distributed. And they viewed him as someone who violated rights. I think we all know the examples. During the Civil War, he was cavalier about rights. But he also was mainly a big government centralizer and even a dictator for his exercise of wartime powers. So there's a libertarian version of this as well. And Wilmer Kendall is no libertarian, right? So this is adding a dimension to that. And then finally, amongst these critiques is probably my favorite, M.E. Mel Bradford. I'm always worried when I say he's my favorite because, of course, he's the most problematic in the sense that he's a segregationist, Southerner, and writes as an unapologetic Southerner. That's his primary identity. He's actually a specialist on Faulkner, William Faulkner. And but one of the great virtues for me in Bradford's critique of Harry Jaffa, and they go at it like cats and dogs in articles that I cite in my footnotes in this article. One of his virtues as a Southerner in criticizing Jaffa is that Mel Bradford as a Southerner is very alive to messianism and religion as it actually exists in America. Southern religion, Southern Baptist religion, evangelicalism, fundamentalism, all of these things, enthusiasm, religious zealotry, its lures and its dangers, in a way that Jaffa, I won't even say anything about Jaffa. I don't know whether he likes that or not, but I will say something about Leo Strauss. Obviously, being at Boston College and having Straussian colleagues, I hear a lot about reason and revelation and about the role, Tocqueville too, about the role of religion, the essential role. And obviously, you know, these things are very important to Leo Strauss. But one question I have in doing this work is, you know, what was Leo Strauss taking into account American religion as it actually existed? My impression is that he wouldn't have known very much about camp meetings and evangelicals. And so he knows a lot about Catholicism, you know, for obvious reasons in the history of political thought. But what Bradford fixes on is Abraham Lincoln as a moral zealot, as a Cromwell, as a Jacobin, as a philosopher. And putting aside, you know, whether this is an accurate description of Lincoln, he recognizes that it's probably more of an accurate description of abolitionism, or at least some sectors of abolitionism. But I'll leave that aside. What Bradford recognizes is that in this zealotry, there is a zeal for imposing abstract theory without regard to the on-the-ground realities. And he's disturbed by Lincoln, as he reads it as a millennialist religious rhetoric, which he argues only grew over time. And Bradford's view was that Jaffa's propositionalism threatened to reintroduce this element into American constitutionalism. And it threatened to reintroduce it through the vision of through the aversion of the presidency, that the president, the great president, would be viewed as coming to restore the country to its natural law foundations by whatever means necessary. So again, I don't want to identify this with the real Lincoln. I actually do think it's quite an accurate description of Harry Jaffa. Maybe this is how political thought works, but Jaffa seems to me extremely un-Lincoln-like, even though he purports to be a fan of Abraham Lincoln. I couldn't imagine anyone less like Abraham Lincoln. So I think Bradford is probably correct in recognizing this in Jaffa, even if it's more debatable when it comes to Abraham Lincoln himself. So Jaffa's approach, I want to underline, is a faith. This is one of my problems with it, and I think a problem that Bradford identified, that it's set out in a very particular way. You either profess this faith, this principle, and Jaffa often put it in exactly those terms. You either profess this faith or you're a heretic. That if you do not profess this faith, right, as that principle, as the foundation of American nationalism and constitutionalism, Jaffa stated very directly, you are aligning yourself with the arguments that were used to justify slavery, right? Whereas those who assent to this are the legatees of the abolitionists. The historical story here brings into these debates what I called in my book vicarious abolitionism, by which current participation in the current culture wars, it's a route to them identifying themselves with the fight against slavery. And one thing that piques me a lot, I mean, it's probably too complicated for conventional discussion, but if I talk to people who don't know, I mean, political scientists who don't know very much about contemporary conservatism, they're always like, oh, they ignore slavery. I mean, maybe they ignore slavery in the way they want them to talk about it, but one thing they certainly don't do is ignore slavery. That slavery is at the center of a lot of conservative constitutional thought right now. And propositionalism is the ground zero for that. They talk about nothing else but slavery and the Civil War. But they do it in this idiosyncratic way, right? So now, again, to return to the issue, I have about 5 minutes, but I'm almost done, I think. To return to the issue of liberalism, aside from being Aristotelian in Jaffa's approach, it turns out, and I don't know if it's fair to emphasize this, but I'm going to say it is, Jaffa himself in temperament is completely illiberal. I mean, he is famous for being single-minded, combative, dogmatic, relentless, absolutist, and sectarian. He does not have what we would call a liberal spirit either. So I do think that matters, because this promotes a certain idea of virtues, and we would not call them liberal virtues in most places. And this all leads to the epigraph in Jaffa of his second book on this, called The New Birth of Freedom. And the epigraph to that book, I will underline, is, "And the war came." Obviously, that is from Lincoln's second inaugural. But the question I raise in the paper is, which war is Jaffa talking about? To be a little Straussian and do a little close reading, the book is purportedly about the Civil War, the 19th century, mid-19th century war. But the discussion always intimates that there is another war on the horizon, and it's time to decide which side you are on. And that's why so many people are motivated by this. So many of his students are motivated by this. He intimates that we're facing once again the need where people will have to arm themselves to redeem the republic, and restore it to its natural law foundations. And obviously, there are intimations in that of violence, and in many cases, a lust for this fight in the way there would be for any war. So one of the arguments I do make in this book is that even though this is a work of serious intellectual history, Jaffa's writings, it's a bridge work that links up with certain moods, elements, temperaments within the Christian right, in popular works like by Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, Walter Luther Pierce, Francis Schaeffer, I'm referring to the Turner Diaries, Left Behind, that it's an apocalyptic vision of a coming war of the godly against the godless. And I think Jaffa thrills to this, and a lot of people that are his students thrill to this. So let me end by bringing this back to Trump. So I do have to pull up a quotation here. So one of the place I want to end with this talk with is talk about the Trumpist Lincoln historian Alan Guelzo, who writes a foreword to a new edition of Harry Jaffa's follow-up book to Crisis of the House Divided, which is called A New Birth of Freedom. Obviously, that's from the Gettysburg Address. And Alan Guelzo, in the foreword to Jaffa's book, this is just recently, this is 2018. Okay, so this is during Trump's presidency. In the foreword, he says, I'd like to explain to readers of Harry Jaffa what Jaffa meant when he spoke about the principles of the equality of natural rights. And he said, and the Declaration, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, but vindicated ultimately by Lincoln in eliminating slavery. Again, this puts a lot of weight on Lincoln. That itself is idiosyncratic. I think most historians, obviously Lincoln was very involved in it, but it's a very complex process. But he says, what did Jaffa mean by equality of natural rights? Let me explain it to you, Alan Guelzo said. And he goes to two chapters, or actually one chapter, the first chapter, I believe, of the Jaffa book. And he says, when he wanted to explain the equality of natural rights and what it meant, Jaffa wrote about the election of 1860 and the election of 1800. There we see what it means for a polity to commit itself to the principle of the equality of natural rights. So I'm going to quote from Guelzo writing about Jaffa on this. The Civil War, Jaffa had reminded his readers, was fundamentally an attempt to nullify the operation of an election. And elections are the fundamental means by which equal citizens in a republic make their consent of the governed known. And he goes on, Guelzo, praising Jaffa for his commitment to the equality of natural rights. He says, he recounts Jaffa's contention that as the author of the Summary of the Rights of British America in 1774 and of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's great wisdom was to explicate the foundations, and I quote from Guelzo, of a political order in which equal citizens agree on the basis of that equality to abide by the conclusions of elections. He doesn't talk about abortion. He doesn't talk about gay rights. He talks about abiding by the results of election as the quintessential example of a respect for the equality of natural rights. And with this, I think propositionalism comes to its full circle with Trump, with the intersection as a mode of constitutional analysis. It essentially, with Trump, arrives at the place where to restore fundamental law, you have to violate or repudiate it. To restore the Constitution, you have to subvert it. To restore philosophy to its rightful place as a cornerstone of the Republic, you have to enlist and justify a violent mob. And to restore virtue, you need to support an amoral, ignorant thug and con man. Bring in the muscle. And it was almost poetic to see within a few weeks of January 6th that at the Conservative Political Action Committee conference, a few weeks later was wheeled in a golden Trump. One of Jaffa's main symbols and main rhetorical devices is referred to the progressives as worshiping a golden calf. So the symmetry of this, it'd have to be eliminated from a novel. It was almost so perfect. So the circle was complete with the wheeling in of the golden Trump. I mean, maybe liberals have always seen that it was likely to end this way. But again, I want to emphasize that at the moment this approach, this constitutional vision, this constitutional nationalism was being forged, conservatives saw the problems with it too. And I think revisiting their critique of this form of constitutional nationalism would be an excellent place for conservatives and others to start to return to a better sense of the nation and of the fundamental law of the Constitution. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was a marvelous and very stimulating talk. I will start taking questions in a minute or two. If you have a question or want to make a comment, please just notify me through chat and I'll be calling on you in the order the questions or requests are received. While you're thinking of your question or comment, let me sort of build on your last point a minute. So it is now 2 months plus since January 6th, 2 months since the end of the Trump administration. Has the experience of a real messianic administration at all affected how those who supported the ideas you talked about, people like Michael Anton and so on, have been thinking about it? They see this as a vindication of their ideas, that the country is in a mess, and only in that the Trump administration was subverted? Or do they look at it in a different way, as a structuralist might, by looking at the way in which a president, important as he might be, is only one part of our constitutional system? So what has been, as far as you know it, the rethinking on the part of the Jaffa students and others who align themselves with that position in response to the actual record of the Trump administration?
I will answer this, but my short answer is I'm not going to be able to answer it because I casually occasionally look at what these people are saying, but I'm not able to tell you systematically and definitively how their views have changed or not. I'm more focused on the past debates. But that said, I can talk about my casual observations about it. Even today, I get emails from the Claremont Institute, and I don't see any slackening of this vision and this understanding. Just this morning, I got an email about an event that Charles Kessler's talking about America's two constitutions and the struggle for the fight for which one is going to win. And the constitutions, the two constitutions are, according to Kessler, the Jaffa'ite propositionalism versus the progressive positivist nihilists. I would note, in light of my talk, that presumes that all the conservatives are Jaffaites, and that these other people that I've mentioned and their constitutional visions don't really exist anymore. That's very presumptuous, at least. Maybe that wouldn't surprise people, but I don't think that they have changed. Now, the question is, Trump is so sui generis that you do wonder whether anyone is going to be as much of a wreck as he is. It's much more likely that you will have people like Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton. I mean, he isn't doing very well, but people on the religious right or with the support of the religious right that are forming visions of this, led by people who are much more skilled, in knowledgeable about the law, knowledgeable about history. And I think it's going to go forward in some form. I also want to say, this will be my last point on this question, that a large part of the conservative rallying around Trump was aimed at capturing the judiciary. And that these ideas are already filtering into the Federalist Society and to the judges. And the one thing I would notice about this, just casually, is that there are all manner of workshops for law students and law clerks, training them about the natural rights, natural law foundations anchored in the Declaration of Independence through Lincoln. That used to be a completely separate world from the legal academy. And I do notice that it is not anymore, that there's a deliberate effort to bring in summer institutes and things like that to train legal actors in this model. So I think the influence is obviously going to come in different ways. Maybe more subtle, maybe more refined, but still important.
Okay, thank you for that. I have now got several questions in. I'm going to take them one at a time. The first questioner is Zach Goldsmith. Do you want to unmute yourself?
All right. Well, thank you, Professor, for a very, as Les said, stimulating talk. I have two questions, I'm afraid, and I'm afraid both might push the bounds of the scope of your presentation. First, it seems to me that when we're talking about the shakeup on the American right, and especially the illiberal elements, most of what we hear is this, what's come to be known as national conservatism, from people like Patrick Deneen and Yoram Hazony. So I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between that school and this Jaffa school, and if there is, they seem to, again, they're seeming to battle to occupy the same kind of organizations, institutions, and so how those ideas intersect. My other question is, as you might know, Aurelian just had a very interesting paper published about Isaiah Berlin and Raymond Aron, and he mentions their Jewish background, speculating potentially that that informs their centrism, concern for institutions, for rights, and a government that protects that. So I'm wondering, and this is, getting into some questions of biography that you might not be so familiar with, but a lot of these characters are Jewish as well, Jaffa and Charles Kessler. And so I'm wondering if you have any idea about how they go on such a different track from other thinkers that were, I guess, before them or roughly contemporary with Jaffa. And instead of supporting institutions that would protect minority rights and things, they end up with the Turner Diaries and the Left Behind series.
Those are really excellent questions. And in the very short time, I'm going to try to do them as much justice as I can. I know more about, obviously some of this is speculation, so I'll take up that offer to speculate. So as far as what you call national conservatism, it's just I'm not as quite. I sometimes think of that as David Brooks and things as well, but maybe I just don't have the terminology. But when you mention Patrick Deneen, that I do have a very clear conception of. So, how does that relate to this? Okay, so the way I see Patrick Deneen, not idiosyncratically, is as a Catholic theorist, not incidentally, but directly. that he is mounting his criticism of liberalism, of liberal individualism from the traditionalist pre-Vatican II Catholic framework. So in that sense, there are others like this on the right, most famously Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School. And their critique is a critique of liberalism per se, from the traditional Catholic, very extensive critique. He's a Catholic traditionalist, okay? Now, that would just be an observation if I didn't add the following, which is what has also happened within Catholic conservatism is that John Courtney Murray proposed a liberal version of Catholicism, which assented to American liberalism, which emphasized the American commitment to the equality of natural rights, separation of church and state, freedom of religion, democracy. Now, as with any Jesuit theorist, Thomist, there's a footnote to this. Murray describes this as articles of peace with modern America. That's not a concession. It's a statement that for the time being, liberal America is good and we assent. Murray offered that, I said in the talk, in a very different spirit, because the spirit was of the Kennedy election, which is when he was writing about this. And it was a claim to integrate Catholics into the American liberal tradition, as they rightly understood it, okay? So I think of Jaffa as much more closer to Murray in some ways, but in spirit, he's much closer to Deneen. So I see him, I guess the word would be at the intersection of those, that he obviously is offering this as liberalism, as an assent to America, more than an assent to America, as a version of American patriotism and nationalism in a very breast-beating form. But his spirit is much more Deneen's spirit, and it has elements of ultramontanism in my view. Now, the other question about Jewish, this is even more speculation for me, right? Because I don't know. And actually, I've never fully understood Jaffa in this regard as a Jew. So obviously, many of the Straussians are not only Jewish, but they're atheists or agnostics, So it can get very complicated very fast because, they have an exemption as philosophers who can handle the truth, whereas ordinary people cannot, and we could just keep going down that rabbit hole. But I will say this about the Jews. Jaffa, biographically, I'm Jewish, by the way, so not very observant. But Jaffa is Strauss's first student at the New School for Social Research in the 30s. And so this is at the center of the exiled Jews in New York City during World War II. So Mark Greif called this was in the air for the Jews, like everyone. I mean, the Jews were escaping the legal, as they understood it, the legal positivism that underwrote Nazism. I've been told by experts on Nazism that I know, because I've asked them about this, that understandings of the roots of Nazism are not the same as they were in the 1930s, and the degree at which is based on pure legal positivism. But I think they took that moment of this clash of civilizations and the rise of positivism in the Nazis and the communists as their model. And I don't know if it has to be with, you can understand why Jews would be particularly attuned to that. But for Jaffa and even for Strauss, I think they carry that forward as a way of doing ordinary politics in America. That they never, everything is always, it's World War II. And American politics has to be understood through the prism of World War II. And there are people who've written about this. One of my favorite books is Edward Purcell's Scientific Naturalism, The Crisis of Democratic Theory, which talks about thought at this time as leading to a revival of natural law thinking, including Catholic natural law thinking in response to World War II. And I just think that even though we've talked a lot about the Civil War, that for Straussians, that kind of is the paradigm. And, in some sense, of course, I'm sympathetic to that. But the question is, do you become so dogmatic about it that you're not able to respond to, development since, or even understandings of Nazism since? It's just very fixated. So there's some connection to Jewishness there. But he's immediately attracted to Aquinas. His first, Jaffa's first book is on Thomas Aquinas. I think that's important to know, that he was intrigued by what he saw as a return to foundations. And it's understandable why, arriving at the time he did, that would be his focus.
Okay, thank you. Next on my list is Michael Weinman.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the talk, and thanks for these remarks. I may as well also, while we're all outing ourselves and we live in a confessional age, so not only am I a Jewish political philosopher, I also have a PhD from the New School, and have spent my whole life being educated by the people who were educated by the people who were educated by Strauss, but not Jaffa. So this question has that kind of a background orientation, right? Because one way of taking the chapter as a whole, but even more explicitly, I think, your presentation today, which was perhaps even more focused this way, is, my God, that's awful, right? I mean, and simply that, and it is awful. But I suppose in the interest of trying to sort of mobilize that kind of sort of outrage and disgust toward toward prescience, I mean, towards some sort of a greater understanding of our present moment, because whether or not a war is coming, and whether or not this whole line of thought from propositionalism and the Messianic executive offers anything to contemporary political discourse other than the opportunity to feel how awful it is, it would be, I think, in something that goes way back to the beginning of the talk, right, to the philosophy in your initial presentation, right, of like kind of the three silos that you wanted to offer comments on. So like totally leaving aside, I'm fascinated by it, but like totally leaving aside for the moment the kind of American policy questions and the sort of the mobilization of a kind of Schmittian, whether it's decisionist or not, it's a Schmittian kind of friend-enemy thinking, clearly, right? As regards the judiciary in particular as a way to restructure the constitutional order in the United States, leaving that aside for the question, and also leaving aside the American history, also fascinating in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but just for a moment, going back to Reason and Revelation, at the risk of like trying your patience, because you get plenty of it, I seem to understand, right? Is there something, this would be my question back to you, I mean, to the chapter, which I guess is also a chapter in a book, right? So there are other things going on, but without, without prejudice to the whole conversation of this, the West Coast Straussians and Claremont and what's happened, and the justification of Trump, and the relationship between conservative critiques of American Caesarism since FDR and Jaffa's reading of Lincoln, leaving all that to the side, is there not, I mean, and this would is basically a reformulation of the question you just answered, but without the intellectual history biography side of it. Is there not something into this argument from Strauss initially and then through Jaffa that American, the liberal with a lowercase l or something, I mean, the Democratic and Republican parties of their form in the post-war period, the Cold War consensus, is there not, in fact, something to the critique that there is a moral vacuousness to that, that your own sort of critical voice seems to share, right, in imputing in the particularly conservative critique of Jaffa, of propositionalism. Is there not, in fact, something to the to this critique from an Aristotelian or from a what I would call Abrahamic Aristotelian, so not Thomas, but really Strauss's Abrahamic Aristotelianism that Jaffa is taking on, that all of us, whatever we are, I mean, all the people who were outraged by West Coast Straussianism actually still need to deal with? Is that a helpful question in any way? That,
Yes.
with all grace to the, to the awfulness of the American history and to the policy stuff, which we should talk about, it's important and it's really hideous from my perspective too. Does that mean, can't we still have this first conversation? Sorry, and I'll stop.
Yes. Okay. No, that's a very helpful question because it does direct us to an important issue about not only moral foundations, but moral foundations within the context of the United States and, American political thought and American constitutionalism. Okay. So look, in a certain sense, this is above my pay grade and probably above my time constraints. But I do want to say something. This will inevitably be a bit of a shallow answer, but I do want to. So, look, my general approach or my general understanding of the United States is probably consistent with most people's understanding of the American political thought tradition, that religion, revelation, especially Christianity, but even more Protestant Christianity, is pervasive and pervasively influential and has been from the beginning. Now we can debate about the founding, some of that arises more from the Great Awakenings, in my view, and all of the country was not settled by Puritans, despite people's frequent treatment of it as if it was. So it's complicated, but I think it's safe to say that a certain belief in moral foundations and even moralism is central. And to the extent that Strauss is insisting, right, that we need to think about that in light of more secular philosophic concerns about what we do and how we do it, I'm okay with that, right? And maybe it's even inevitable if you're a serious student of American political thought. That said, however, I take a lot of the things that they are criticizing. I'm talking about the application of it now in contemporary politics of Straussians. Strauss famously didn't write much about America, and most of my colleagues don't because they're East Coast Straussians, but it's the West Coast Straussians who tend to write about it. And I think there are a lot of assumptions that they make that take these truths that I've just, suggested and distort them and make it very hard for us to understand appropriately these influences. First of all, a lot of the evangelical Christian influence, a lot of the focus on morals and moral law comes through evangelicalism. A lot of it is on what we would consider the left, as was abolitionism itself. And it is true that many of the contemporary movements are more secular, possibly just owing to the time, but I don't think they've lost anything of their evangelical moralism. And I think that's consistent with the American political tradition, you know, whether it's gay rights or whether it's feminism or, I mean, 19th century feminists spoke a lot about the Declaration of Independence and the equality of natural rights, as did civil rights movement leaders. And obviously, so I think they are attributing things that are happening in America to Nazism and Nazi positivism that in fact are rooted in American traditions of evangelical moral reform. So that distorts it. You know, sometimes I've never used this before, although I've scribbled it on scraps of paper around my apartment. So I welcome the opportunity you've given me to use it, which is, you know, the West Coast Straussians talk a lot about virtue. You know, this is a Straussian thing. They act as if that's the only possible reading of American political thought rather than one strain of republicanism or Christianity. It's certainly not the whole thing, but, you know, I sometimes think that they believe more in sanctimony than virtue, or that they confuse sanctimony and virtue, and that this is a risk of Leo Strauss. So, for example, the West Coast people talk incessantly about Lincoln, abolitionism, slavery, the legacy of the Civil War. They've updated this with African-American figures. For a long time, it was Frederick Douglass, for obvious reasons. And now they've added Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail for obvious reasons. But I'll be just crude about this. They don't give a damn about removing voting rights from Black people or about the police treatment of Black people, that it's enough of them to say, to identify themselves with King through his commitment to natural law, thence to Lincoln, thence to Jefferson, and that's good enough for them, you know? And so not only do they not understand their enemies, but they're using this religion and moralism to insulate themselves from very real issues that they are happy to claim the mantle of, but are not seriously interested in, you know? And I think that's a serious problem. So in the abstract, I agree with you. In the application, I think the way that it's processed is very problematic. And it's predisposed to that. It doesn't have to go in that direction, but you can certainly see why it does if someone wants to take it there.
Okay, Bill Scheuerman is next.
Hey, Ken, thank you so much. I learned a lot, very much enjoyed it. As one of those progressives with an interest in executive power, I can tell you I knew nothing about this and I need to know more. So I'm very grateful. But just two questions, comments. I'm trying to figure out exactly where the continuities and discontinuities are. And there are some things that suggest to me that there actually might be some continuities we should emphasize a bit more. So for example, one of the things you're talking about is what I would call this starkly anti-legalist, anti-constitutionalist notion of executive power. I mean, that seems to be what we saw with Trump, right? I mean, you may dress this up in the Constitution, but you're talking about a mob attacking the Capitol and justifying that. That's where you ended, right? I mean, you get a version of that in Harvey Mansfield's book on the modern executive, it seems to me, right? Where he traces the modern executive, including the American presidency, to the Machiavellian tradition in a very complicated way. So, you see some forerunners to that, arguably. Now, the other thing that I think is maybe more interesting is, you know this literature, but there's this old critique of presidentialism. Juan Linz and then Bruce Ackerman picks it up, right? And they make the argument that because of the institutional structure of presidential systems, it's very common to see executives claiming a higher aura, right? Talking about their charisma, So one could argue that what you're describing is just one variety of this kind of rather disturbing thing, right? The messianism that's built into any sort of presidential system, right? Because the president has to depict himself or herself as above the normal sort of dirty world of politics, And you get